Okay, well, welcome to this Friday's drop-in session where I want to introduce you to a topic which I called Beyond Process Mapping. And this is really exploring some of the other areas of functionality that Skore provides in terms of trying to understand the different, have a much deeper understanding of the roles and the people involved within a process. And so I'm going to take you through a bit of a story actually that's based on a real project that I worked on, and I'm going to talk through the process that we went through and what we were trying to achieve out of it in terms of understanding. Essentially, it was an organizational design piece of work, so we were actually creating a completely new part of the organization. So the bit of background on the company. So they are a tech software company that had grown organically over a number of years. They did something that was quite unique in their space, so kind of really set them apart from everybody else, and that had allowed them to hit a kind of market dominating position. But they had done that because they had this sort of uniqueness about them. They never really had to invest a huge amount in market awareness and marketing. As I say, it had grown quite organically. And what had happened is they'd hit a bit of a ceiling. So they kind of hit not really saturated the market, but their sales had slowed down considerably. And at the same time, there were new entrants coming into the market that were doing what they were doing. Sometimes they were doing it a little bit better or faster or whatever. So there was a threat in their space. So the team sat down or did a bunch of research, interviewing both customers and market research. And what they found was that over the years, the product had actually grown to become quite rich, but they were really only known for doing one thing well. And so their existing customers weren't really aware of what else they did, what other things the product did. So there was an opportunity for growth within existing customers. And actually, there was a large part of the market that thought they only did this one thing, which wasn't something that particular customer required, but didn't realize that they offered other things as well. Oh, sorry, could I ask everyone to just go on mute? I think just a bit of feedback there. Thank you. So there were two opportunities essentially. Actually, the market was potentially bigger than they thought, and they could easily grow existing customers. So they set about looking at essentially designing a new marketing organization, and they wanted it to be quite. They wanted to bring new talent in around social media and really start to take advantage of influencers across the internet, and so on. So the actual initial piece of work or the project was about, I think it was about 6 to 8 weeks of work spread over a period of time. And within each week, it was about 2 days worth of actual work within each week. And essentially what they started off by doing is saying, okay, well, once they had established what they wanted to try and achieve in terms of creating this market awareness, the first workshops were all about what is the work that we need to do to actually deliver this. And so hopefully you can see the process on the screen here. So at a very high level, they said, look, we've got to set our strategic planning, we've got to build a network of influencers, we've got to have a process for creating and updating content, everything of which had been sort of ad hoc before. And then we need processes in which we can disseminate that information out to the market. And just like, as you know, with Skore, we can take each one of these boxes and we can break these down into more detail. So they went to roughly 3 levels of detail. They didn't want to go into too much detail because at the point they said, what we're going to do ultimately is we're going to hire people, or we're going to train existing team members up to fill these roles. And we want them to have the final say on actually how do these processes work in detail. This was all about trying to work out who do we need in the business and what sort of skills and competencies are required to deliver this work. So the first iteration was all about creating those high-level processes. What are the key things we need to do and how are we going to do them? once they'd done that, and at that point, there was a very clear message was, we don't want to talk about or think about roles at this time. We purely want to think about the work that we're delivering. And then the second iteration came again on another set of 2-day workshops, where they said, right, what are the roles then that we need to deliver this work? So that exercise actually started off with a brainstorm on a whiteboard, and it was, okay, what do we think the roles we're going to need? We think we're going to need a marketing manager, we think we're going to need an external relations manager, a product marketing manager, and so on. So they put those up on the board and then went through the process again. So it was another iteration, and actually then said for each step who needs to be involved. And we did this using RACI, although the example I've got here is an alternative to RACI. But just to give you an example of what that means, so it's a responsibility model that allows us to look at a particular activity and say, okay, who owns that activity? So who's essentially responsible for the output of the activity, and who is who's actually doing the work. So the T in this stands for task, so we can start to understand who's owns the work and who's doing it. So for example, in this one about defining topics, we can see that we've got 3 different people involved in that work. Here, wherever we've got a drop down or a details view underneath a step, we only put the responsibles, the person who ultimately owns it. And if I click down there, you'll see then the further breakdown where we've split those out. And so over those couple of days, again, as I said, we went through that iteration of going through and putting each one of those on. At that point, we were able to then refine the roles and think about, to start to look at, actually, do these make sense? So as you'll know from Skore, one of the things we do is we have the role manager, and I can take a particular role. So let's take the marketing manager. And you know, when we look at a role in the role manager, it tells us how many activities they're involved in. So I've got this one selected, and you'll see it then gives us that list of all the roles, including whether they own the work or whether they're just doing the work, or one of the other levels of responsibility as well. So you can see straight away in this case with the marketing manager, there's quite a lot of activities involved in here. But this is essentially the job description. The other thing it starts to give us, it gives us a bit of an overview of the responsibilities, any associations with attachments. Interesting, it starts to tell you who do they collaborate with. So what the collaborators section is doing is saying where this role appears on an activity with another role, that's a collaboration. So for example, the marketing manager, you can see, sits on 25 activities alongside the product marketing manager, which suggests they're working quite closely together. Now, one of the things we added in here to the system, which makes this really interesting, is if I go and hit the Insights tab. So it gives me, straight away, it gives me a visual overview of how many times a particular role appears in the process. And this version I've got here was actually one of the very early iterations of the exercise, because I wanted to demonstrate what we did. And you can see straight away the marketing manager comes out by far and away, you know, almost double, I think it is, the next near, more than double the next nearest role, in fact. So that straight away is of interest. Now, you could argue that this is a marketing process, so it's not, comes as no surprise, but it is of interest. So it's an area that we want to dig down a little bit more in. Of course, with the responsibilities, we also show us various visualizations, and the interesting one for us here, and in fact, when we did this project, we didn't actually have this feature in Skore. We did it in a spreadsheet, but it's essentially where these graphs came from. So we can then start to look at the balance of responsibilities, because most of these people in this team are going to be full-time members of this team. And so actually, what we realized very early on is we'd be looking for, there's going to be a sort of senior leader, sort of management team within that group, and that they should probably have a relative balance in terms of the number of responsibilities they have. So you could see immediately that the marketing manager was, again, 3 times the next nearest role in terms of that level of responsibilities. And actually what that prompted then was a really interesting discussion about, okay, let's go back and look at the role description for the marketing manager, see what they're doing, and then really have a conversation about, okay, is this actually what this role should be doing? Because one person can't cover all of those things. And what they ended up doing actually is discovering that there was a balance between some of the activities or work that was much more technical focused versus some of the less technical focused work. And this was things that they wanted the product marketing manager, who they were expecting to be a much more technically focused role. So what we were able to do is then actually iterate again through the process by using the role descriptions and clicking through to those activities and going, okay, this one that the marketing manager does, actually we think this is the product marketing manager. And so again, through another iteration, if you like, we were able to come back and see these graphs come right down to much more of a balance. I think the marketing manager still was above everyone else, but they were all quite similar in terms of the number of responsibilities they had. So it was a really sort of powerful visualization to help understand those particular roles. And another thing we did, which I didn't actually have the copy of the original work, but I've replicated to some extent, was to then start to think about the skills and competencies. And the approach that we took here was, rather than look at each role description and say, well, what do we think their competencies should be? We looked at it from an activity by activity perspective. And we said, okay, based on this piece of work, what are the competencies? What are the competencies were required? I'm trying to think where we've got them in here. Let me go back up to the top. What we did initially is we took a standard model of the company had its own competency model, and we loaded it into the system. So you'll see here, I've got a list of all the competencies for this particular example. And using the custom field, so we've added a custom field and called it competency, and then used the note to describe what that competency is: integrated analytics, brand marketing capability, corporate communications, and so on. And then we were able to go through again, another iteration of the process, going through the process and saying, okay, at each individual step, what is the competency required to deliver this piece of work? So thinking about it again, without the roles, it's focus on the work. What are the skills and competencies required to deliver this piece of work? And so step by step, putting it on there. So what that allowed us to do, if I go back to the roles tab, was then start to look at that breakdown of competencies. And again, this demonstrates that situation we had with the marketing manager, where the marketing manager was covering too many different things. So here, what the graph shows us is it shows us each role that has a competency associated with them. So that's because the custom field's been attached to the box, the activity, and that role has been associated with that activity, so they have a relationship there. And with the marketing manager, you can see again that he's got the most in there because he's on the most number of activities. But you can also then drill down and look at those and say, okay, what are each of those competencies the marketing manager has against them? And say, does that make sense? Because some of the competencies are quite tactical and some of them are quite strategic. And so you can again start to have a really interesting conversation about, for this type of role, this level of position, should those competencies be more strategic focused and less tactical, whereas somebody else in the model might have a more tactical focus versus a strategic focus. So again, that also prompted another iteration of reviewing the process to make sure we had the right people. And ultimately what you end up with then is quite a nice, clean job description. So let me pick one of the other ones. Let's take the product marketing manager, where I think they all came, the manager level roles all came out at around sort of 45, I think, activities each. So again, the role, you've got the nice role description that talks about their responsibilities, it talks about the actual work they need to do, and then it also shows what are the key competencies that they should have. And you could actually go one step further and use the comment field to actually put in what that competency level might be. Do they need to be fully competent at it, or can they be just a beginner? And so that gives you that sort of real basis of that's a good job description, or at least the basis of a very powerful job description to understand, do we have somebody in the team that fits this today, or nearly fits it, and what's the training and skills gap that we need to fill, or is this new talent that we need to go out to the market to find? Based on those, and we printed these out so everyone could sort of sit there with them in front of them. We actually then brainstormed an org chart, and again, I've got an example of that here. So this was just a case of, let's chuck a bunch of boxes or sticky notes onto the page with the names of all the different roles that we'd already brainstormed earlier, and then now, based on what we know their responsibilities are, what we know the competency levels are, how do those start to organize and arrange within an org chart? So this conversation actually was very, very quick and easy, because once you'd been through all of those iterations through the process, everybody had a pretty good idea about the level of seniority that each person would have in there. So it was a very quick discussion about just organizing the different roles into the different teams here. What we didn't do, and potentially we could have done, although I'd argue this was something that you'd want to do a bit later on when you have gone to another level of detail with defining the process, is you could actually use the quantify module to really work out, are each of these a full-time equivalent? Like, is there enough work in the process to use somebody full-time on this? Or do you go out and outsource pieces of that role or that work? But essentially what this project was about sort of understanding what the structure looked like, what were the processes, and then going and starting to hire or train up this level. The marketing director was already in place, and it was this next level down. Do we have them or do we hire them? And then these managers would then be responsible for that next level of detail and finding the right people within the organization. Just one quick last thing that we did here, just to sort of kind of complete the picture, if you like, and bring things together, was very simply, we've used the attachment feature within the the linking feature within Skore to actually link back to the roles. So you'll see I've made the top level roles at the very least clickable. So I click on the training manager, it jumps to the training manager role description within the role manager. And again, you've seen this before, I'm sure, that from here I can then click on the activities within the role description to actually take me into the process to see where that particular activity exists. So other thing, aside from the quantified piece, the other thing that I don't have in this example, which was another thing that we looked at in the original project certainly, was what were the tools and systems that were required. And again, we did this at quite a high level, so we didn't want to go into too much detail. We just wanted to get a very high level of what sort of tools we'd expect the team to need. But the idea was that as they started to build the team out, they would then go to that level of detail. And at that point, I'm going to stop and ask if there are any questions.